The corridor stretched out forever in both directions. He couldn't remember which way he had come. The screams of the dead and dying echoed all around. He could hear his demons calling in the darkness, shapeless fiends dragging themselves over the stone floor towards him. He wanted to run, but his feet had become attached to the ground, and he couldn't free them. An almost sweet stench of putrefaction filled the air. They were so close now. His fear became overwhelming, and he started to scream, just as bony claws grasped his shoulders and began to shake him back and forth. "Glover, wake up! Stop that bloody noise, come on!" His eyes snapped open. The shaking stopped. A familiar face filled his vision. It was wearing a weary grin and spoke with a strong Cockney twang. "See, I told you he was all right." "Sarge?" "Well, it's not bloody Santa. Come on, let's get you up and see if you can stand." He hauled him up onto his feet. Glover stood blinking in the cold as his memory forced itself into focus. He remembered the plane and the parachute jump. Then there was the long march through the snow. Then it came back to him. The patrol. There had been a German patrol. "What the hell happened?" "You had a lucky escape, old son." He leant over and tapped the side of Glover's head with a thickly gloved hand. It came away with a light coating of blood. "A bullet grazed your skull. You went out like a light." "Christ, is everyone else all right?" "They're fine. See?" He looked around the clearing. The other 3 members of his squad were busy ransacking corpses for souvenirs. A full moon illuminated them as they worked, snowflakes falling gently all around. Their warm breath formed small clouds as it condensed in the sub-zero temperature. The gnarled denizens of the forest watched silently, their branches draped in rich robes of white. Red rivers of plasma seeped out of the dead Germans and froze in pools on the ground. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called out for its mate. It was like being in some lunatic's idea of a Christmas card, he thought. "Right, you lot, we need to move." Reluctantly, the men stood up, flashing Glover nods and knowing smiles. Packs were tightened and rifles adjusted, and then they were off. Sarge glanced at his compass and then his watch. Satisfied, he nodded to himself, and they crunched on through the night. Thomas fell in beside Glover. "Thought you were a goner there, Frank. How are you doing?" "Bit of a headache, but that's all. Happy to be alive, I suppose." "Well, try not to get shot again, boyo. Plays havoc with my nerves, that sort of thing, you know." "I'll do my best." "Would you 2 ladies keep it down over there if you'd be so kind?" "Sorry, Sarge." It took them about half an hour to clear the forest. On the other side, they emerged at the top of a hill. Their target was spread out below them. High walls, complete with watchtowers and barbed wire, surrounded the sprawling complex. Spotlights scanned the sky, and soldiers with dogs patrolled the perimeter. Within, they could see numerous buildings and what looked like a small chemical plant. A sprinkling of planes and vehicles were rapidly vanishing under the falling snow. "Right, hit the deck, boys. Armitage, crank up the radio." They ripped off their packs and sprawled along the ridge to wait for the show to begin, while Sarge made the call. "Albatross, this is Blizzard. Over." The radio crackled uselessly. "Bloody hell. Albatross, this is Blizzard. Over." This time a voice formed from the static. "Blizzard, this is Albatross. Are you in position? Over." "Roger, Albatross. We are in position. Over." "Excellent, Blizzard. We should be with you in about 10 minutes. Prepare for fireworks." Glover rubbed the side of his head. It itched slightly, but all things considered, it was barely a minor irritation. He had been wounded at Keren, so he knew very well what damage fast-moving metal could do. It felt like his lucky day. Keren had been a different thing. Hot, dry, bloody flies that never gave you a moment's rest. The fighting had been intense. The Italians had been true warriors. He'd killed a lot of them before he took 2 bullets, one to the leg and one to the chest. He was carried out of that battle, shell-shocked and broken. It had taken him time to recover, and he still had nightmares about it. "You still all right, Glover?" "Never better, Sarge." They could hear the low drone of the Lancasters approaching now. Soon they came into view, clearly visible on this crisp winter's night. The Germans saw them too, and the air was suddenly thick with anti-aircraft fire. Almost immediately, flames licked around the wing of the first plane. It dipped to one side as it came in over the base, dropping its load wide of the mark before turning away, trailing smoke. "Bastards!" Armitage shook his head. The others grimaced at him sympathetically and turned their attention back to the action. The second plane was dead on target, and an avalanche of ordnance dropped from its belly. A sprinkling of incendiaries hit first. Buildings started to burn. Some fuel tanks exploded. The air then filled with a high-pitched whine. "Heads down! Tall boy!" They buried their faces in the snow and listened as 3,000 pounds of Torpex detonated not half a mile away. The wave of noise and heat rolled over them. They didn't look up as the third and last bomber let loose its equally destructive load and headed off for home. Finally, they peered down at what looked like the end of the world. The outer wall was largely gone, and the interior was a mass of smoke and flames. A mushroom-shaped plume of green fumes billowed up over the top of the chaos below. Sarge keyed the radio. "Target destroyed. Safe trip home, Albatross." "Thanks, Blizzard. Good luck." He handed the mic back to Armitage and beckoned for the others to gather round him. Once they had brushed off the snow and were crouched around him, he spoke. "Okay, gentlemen, you know the drill. Remember your training. We're going in. Watch your backs, and good luck." He looked at the clouds enveloping the base and bit his lip. "Gas masks on." They ran and skidded their way down the slope, guns at the ready. On the edge of the wall, they engaged a group of confused stragglers, putting them down easily as they stumbled around, trying to get their bearings. Inside, there was no visible life. A sea of corpses littered the ground. The tall boy had torn open a huge chasm, revealing an access tunnel to the underground facilities below. They were expecting that. Intelligence had suggested that the important work would be found in offices concealed from prying eyes. Sarge motioned for them to follow him down. They clambered over the rubble and into the tunnel. Parts of the ceiling had collapsed, but they were able to make their way through. Incredibly, a few lights remained on, doubtless powered by a well-protected emergency generator. As the passage bent round a corner, they heard a muffled series of booms. "Sounds like bloody grenades," mumbled Thomas from behind his mask. 3 black-clad Gestapo officers burst out from a side opening, Lugers in hand. They managed a couple of poorly aimed shots before all 5 intruders peppered them with fire from their Sten guns. After a very short display of traditional German dance, they fell onto the concrete. The squad stepped over them and went down the passage from which the Nazis had emerged. It opened into a small, smoke-filled room where there were 6 steel-barred prison cells. Small chunks of flesh and material littered the whole area. Blackened sections of wall indicated where the grenades had landed. "Bastards!" said Thomas in his thick Welsh Valley accent. Glover picked up a tattered strip of grey material and held it up for the others to see. "This looks like it comes from a German uniform." "Why the hell would they grenade their own men?" Glover shrugged and followed Sarge back out into the main tunnel. He noticed for the first time that a thin tendril of green was wafting down from outside and tightened his gas mask. Inwardly, he cursed the Nazis and their experimental weapons programs. They had no idea what was being done here. Spies on the ground had reported that there was something, and that it was a big something. This wasn't very informative. The presence of civilians in lab coats had been mentioned, but this didn't much clarify the situation either. They arrived at a large double door. Kicking it open, they found themselves inside a laboratory. Smashed equipment and fallen ceiling tiles lay all around. Workbenches were covered with broken glass and scattered chemistry equipment. In the first one, a large cable had been severed and it hissed and sizzled in the corner. They gave it a wide berth and moved on to the next room. This one had been rigged out as an operating theatre. At its centre was a blood-stained table with leather restraints attached at both ends. An equipment trolley with the usual array of syringes and scalpels stood by its side. "What were these bloody bastards up to in here?" Sarge signalled for them to be quiet and gestured towards a closed door at the back of the room. They could hear rapid talking and movement on the other side as they approached. Weapons at the ready, they flattened themselves up against the wall and edged towards the entrance. At the pre-arranged gesture, they burst in. Two terrified-looking scientists were tearing up a pile of documents. They had almost finished. Glover grabbed one and Thomas grabbed the other. "Ask them what they're doing here." "Was machst du hier?" asked Armitage. Neither of them said anything. "We don't have time for this. Glover, put your pistol to that one's head." "Was machst du hier?" They remained silent, averting their eyes. "Glover, shoot that bastard!" Glover looked at Sarge as questioningly as he could while wearing a gas mask. Sarge nodded. Glover pushed the Browning into his prisoner's neck and looked pointedly at his prisoner and then his colleague. They both remained silent. He pulled the trigger and let his man drop to the floor. His ears rang from the noise in the small room. "Was macht du hier?" This time the remaining scientist actually looked at them. Glover thought for a moment that perhaps he was going to tell them something useful. He shook his head and started wheezing and drooling. His whole body started to convulse. "Suicide capsule," cursed Sarge. They watched, silent apart from the wheezing of their breath filtering through the masks, as the man went through his final death spasm and joined his companion on the floor. When the German had finally stopped twitching, Armitage looked at the few documents remaining. He stuffed them into his pack. "There's sod all here." Sarge shook his head. "Never mind. Let's move on. We haven't got time for this." As they trailed out of the room, McMordy started to cough. None of them were small, but McMordy was a giant amongst them. Glover didn't think he'd said a word since he had woken up in the forest. "You all right, Jock?" "Don't call me bloody Jock." He coughed some more, the sound peculiar from inside the mask. Armitage stood on his tiptoes and fiddled with the straps. "That's fine, Armitage. Leave me alone." "Have it your own way, big man." They made their way back through the labs and back into the passageway. The tunnel descended slightly and began to widen. Soon they heard the sounds of gunfire and shouting. "Keep 'em peeled, lads." The tunnel opened out into a vast chamber filled with all manner of war-related machinery. Several transport planes sat surrounded by a variety of armoured vehicles and trucks. Pallets of canvas-covered military supplies lay waiting to be loaded. A few slabs of rock had fallen from the ceiling, but generally damage from the bombing was surprisingly minimal. Having taken all of this with a cursory glance, their attention fell on the firefight that was taking place at the end of the cavern. What the hell? A dozen or so lightly armed Germans were shooting frantically at an oncoming mob of at least 20 of their own men. The bullets seemed to be having little effect on the attackers. Thomas levelled his machine gun at the scene, but Sarge pushed his barrel down. "Hold on. Look closer at that lot's faces." They squinted through the acrylic-covered eye-holes in their masks. It became obvious that there was something very wrong with their attackers. Their eyes were bulging and miscoloured, and their skin was a bloodless grey. As they watched, they saw them sustaining injuries that should have killed a man, but which didn't even slow them down. The first to reach the defensive dozen had his lower jaw blown off, but it didn't seem to bother him. With a bellow of anger, he sank his upper teeth into the neck of the nearest soldier. They watched, dumbfounded, as the pair grappled on the floor. A few seconds later, the rest of the horde struck. It was a massacre. 4 of the creatures literally pulled a man apart as they fought over him. Another twisted a German's head right off and chewed hungrily on his prize's face. The remaining men disappeared under a shroud of relentless carnage. None of the commandos spoke or moved a muscle. They were professional killers, but this had paralyzed them. Glover's mind absorbed the scene without understanding. What he was seeing simply made no sense. As usual, Sarge was the first of them to get a grip on the situation. "Grenades, now!" 4 grenades descended onto the frenzy before detonating. A fireball erupted, throwing body parts in all directions. A moment's silence passed before Glover realized that there should have been 5 grenades. He span around to see McMordy looming over them. His gas mask hung around his neck, revealing his face. He had taken on the same graveyard pallor as the creatures. One of his eyes had rolled back in his head, and the other twitched uncontrollably. A swathe of spittle covered his lips. Armitage took a step towards him. "Jock, are you—" "Armitage, for Christ's sake, get away from him!" His warning came too late. With one hand, McMordy grasped Armitage by the throat and lifted him off the ground. He slammed him into the wall and ripped his mask off. Armitage struggled weakly, blood pouring from his nose. There was a loud crack as McMordy slammed him against the wall again, breaking his skull. With nothing more than a gentle moan, he died. The giant Scotsman pulled him close and sank his teeth into his neck. As one, Sarge and Glover pulled out their service pistols and emptied them into his back. He dropped his meal and turned towards them. His face was stained red with Armitage's blood. Before he could move, Thomas pushed the others aside and put his gun into McMordy's mouth and aimed upwards. 4 shots were enough to create an enormous hole where the top of the Scotsman's head had been. He fell to the floor. They stepped over him to look at Armitage. His face had that empty appearance exclusive to the thoroughly dead. "Bloody hell!" Thomas nudged him with his foot. "His missus was just about to have their second babby too." "This is bollocks." Glover was starting to lose his temper. He didn't like not knowing what was going on, and none of this made sense. "Right, calm down, lads." Sarge sounded tense. Glover wished he could see his face instead of the gas mask. "Check your gear. It's obviously the gas that's doing this. I don't know how, but I've seen enough. We're leaving." "Too right. If I get my bloody hands on—" Thomas's Welsh lilt was cut short and replaced by a shriek of pain. "Ah! Get off! Get it off!" Armitage had pulled himself off the floor using Thomas's trouser leg and was now trying to bite through the material. Thomas was trying to shake him loose, but Armitage had wrapped his arms around the leg and wasn't letting go. Glover grabbed the hood of the dead man's coat and pulled him back, but had to let go to avoid being bitten himself. Sarge was straight in with a boot to the side of the head. Glover followed it with another, and Armitage finally released Thomas and fell on his back. He looked up at them from the floor, his expression venomous. Glover stared at him, willing himself to see some trace of humanity. There was none. As he looked, there was a loud bang, and Armitage's head exploded. "Bastard!" Thomas stood holding his smoking gun. The others could hear him heavy breathing through the ventilator on his mask. "Bloody double bastard!" "Right, boys, reload. We're getting the hell out of here." Retracing their steps brought them back to the laboratory entrance. As they approached, the 2 scientists burst out of the double door. The head of the one that Glover had shot in the neck hung awkwardly to one side. Dried blood matted the wound and the front of his white lab coat. The suicide's face was entirely green, and his lips had retracted away from his teeth. They growled and stumbled towards the British soldiers. The air filled with flying bullets as 3 entire clips into them tore lab coats and flesh into shreds. Eventually they all ran dry and stopped firing. The scientists lay on the floor, still twitching despite being torn to shreds. Thomas stepped into the swirling cloud of smoke and dust and stamped on each of their heads in turn. Bloody bastards! Thomas busied himself reloading again, but couldn't help but think of his wife and daughter. It was Christmas Eve, and he had promised that he would make it home before New Year's Eve. Now he doubted that he would get home at all. "Sarge, if I don't make it back, go and say sorry to Claudia and the kid, will you? Tell them I did my best." "Only if you go and apologise to my cat if something happens to me. Don't be stupid. We're getting out of here." "Come on, let's go." Thomas pushed on down the corridor, and the others followed him. It was only when he disappeared around a corner a little further on that Glover remembered. "Thomas, the bloody Gestapo!" Sarge and Glover broke into a run, but it was too late. A handful of shots rang out as they caught up with Thomas. He staggered backwards into the others with his hand over his heart. Waves of blood pulsed out between his fingers. While Sarge laid him down gently on the concrete floor, Glover sprayed the black-clad ghouls with the Sten. He could see that one of them still had his Luger in hand and that his trigger finger was repeatedly squeezing the trigger despite having run out of ammunition. His arms waved wildly as he moved. Thomas had been killed by a lucky shot. Glover's own weapon clicked uselessly as another clip ran empty. The 4 Germans were full of holes. He had caught one of them in the eye and almost detached the arm of another, but they kept on coming. He saw red and, using the gun as a club, laid into them. Disoriented, they lunged at him, but he was too fast. A head flew off, then another. He kicked out the legs from under one of them and jumped on his ribcage, revelling in the sound of cracking bones. Suddenly he was face to face with the last of them. His eyes were yellow and his cheeks streaked with tears of blood. The muscles around his mouth seemed to be going into spasm, and it wasn't until later that Glover realised that he had been trying to smile. "Wir sind," his voice was a gargled whisper. "Wir sind die Untoten." Glover slammed his fist into his face, sending the creature flying backwards into the wall. He bounced off it, sending his peaked cap flying in one direction and him stumbling in the other. Without hesitation, Glover was behind him with his arm around his neck, squeezing with all his strength. With his free arm, he managed to reach down and pull out his boot knife. In a murderous frenzy, he stabbed the man's chest repeatedly, but he still squirmed in his grip. "Will you bloody die?" Through the haze, he felt Sarge tapping him on the shoulder. "Let go and get ready to run." Glover released his prisoner and Sarge grabbed him by the scruff of the neck. He rammed a grenade into his mouth, pulled the pin and gave him a mighty shove to the chest. "Right now, run!" They didn't stop until they were back outside again. Snow was falling in thick, wet clumps, and a cutting wind was blowing it sideways. The green gas was still visible in places, making the light cast by the moon seem eerie and unreal. There didn't seem to be any living left, but the reanimated had turned on each other. Sarge slapped Glover on the back and laughed. "Christ, Glover, have you seen yourself lately?" He looked down at his formerly white camouflage fatigues. They were filthy with gore and streaks of black. Hardly any of it was untouched. "You're not looking much flasher, Sarge." "True enough, Glover, true enough. Come on, I think we might find a ride over there." A row of Kubel wagons stood alongside a collapsed warehouse building on the far side of the compound. They jogged towards them, giving a wide berth to any of the creatures. Glover's head was ringing from the combination of adrenaline and the noise of warfare. His body ached in protest at not being allowed to rest, but the end looked to be in sight, and he carried on. The first that he saw of the dog was a black shape streaking past him and leaping on Sarge. It knocked him onto his back. The hound tore at his face, dislodging his gas mask. The beast had a huge wound in its side, and a good part of its intestines were spilling out from it. It should have been dead. Sarge grabbed a handful of fur, and the two rolled around in the snow. Glover pulled out his pistol and looked for a clear shot. The sound of barking alerted him to the imminent arrival of another dog, but he couldn't see through the weather to see where it was coming from. He was paralysed by uncertainty and exhaustion. "Just bloody go! They need to know! Go! I'll catch up if I can! Sarge, The second dog emerged from the darkness. Ignoring Glover, it joined the first in biting and tearing at Sarge. Glover ran for the vehicles and jumped into the first one that he reached. The engine started first time. Ahead, he could see that Sarge had lost the battle and was not fighting anymore. With a scream of fury, he floored the accelerator. The wheels span for a second before finding traction and propelling him forwards. The two dogs bounced off the front with a thud, and Sarge's corpse tangled with the wheels. At least he wouldn't have to endure coming back as one of those things. Glover didn't look back as he steered out over the broken fence and into the countryside beyond. He felt no relief as he careered down the slush-covered road en route to the extraction point. There was only a sense that a dark shadow had been released on the world, and that getting out from under it was going to be an impossible task. Whether they had opened Pandora's box or were simply witnesses to the evils others had released, terrible times lay ahead for mankind. It was going to be a very long winter.